What's going on, creators? Yeah, just want to get on here and share some tips and techniques to take your music mixes to the next level. First tip would be to mix your music with visuals, whether that be scenes of a movie, scenes of a video game, scenes of concert footage, just any type of visual that can kind of take you out of like being so involved in the mix that you're not hearing the overall picture is really important, especially when it comes to mixing drums. A lot of times it's easy to like think that you're doing it so it sounds good, but then if you pull up like footage of an actual drummer playing some beats and overlay what you're doing on top of it, it's like, wow, that sounds really off. And like the snares are either way too soft, or it's like the hi-hats, especially because hi-hats can really cut through a mix pretty easily with it being such high-end sounds. It's important then to like pull up like a visual of a drummer to really get that feel as you're gaining experience in doing that. Same with concert footage, especially. Say you're mixing in like rock music, pull up just like a rock band that you can just, mute what they're doing, overlay what you're doing in your mix, and see if it sounds good or not. A lot of times you can kind of get lost in your own mind as you're mixing. I was like, I think that sounds good, or that sounds okay. I think the level of the bass is good, or the guitars is good, the keys, or whatever you're doing. But then when you overlay it to an actual concert, it's like, man, that sounds really lame. And so it's important to use visuals in mixing, especially when you're really getting familiar with the levels. Over time, you maybe not have to do that as much, but I feel like it's still a benefit so that you can start to really get a feel of how it's going to work outside of just your DAW, and so using reference mixes is another technique where you can bring in songs that are in that same style that you're mixing, and just see how their instruments are sitting in your DAW. It's really important to get a feel for what works and what doesn't for like the end user being like your listener. If you're just making like album music, if you're doing publishing music with visuals and sync licenses, your end user would be just like media creators and stuff. And so you're really making music for other people, and so it's important that you take the skills that you know how to do and translate them so that it's pleasing to others. It's really important. And so besides using visual references and audio references, it's really important to start using parametric EQing on each instrument, so you can really get them to sit well in a mix. Because what happens is, as you combine instruments, maybe like the low end instruments especially, you can really start to lose a lot of clarity in like the low end as you layer up different kind of low to mid sounding instruments, like a bass, low registers on your keyboard, guitars. A lot of those can start to really muddy up the low register, kick drums, toms, all those kinds of things. As you layer them up, you start to lose clarity if you're not EQing that low end out, sculpting the sound. A lot of times you'll get like the 300 kilohertz range is really muddy when it comes to like guitars. Bass can start to really lose a lot of punch in that range, and so getting an EQ on like every instrument is really important in shaping those sounds. Panning them off the center a little bit can help give you some space to get some more clarity in the low end. And then compression is another really important thing to keep in mind as you're mixing. And when it comes to the compression, you can get carried away with it and lose a lot of like dynamic range in your mixes if you're really compressing the shit out of every instrument. And so use it sparingly, especially as you're building those layers up. The low end, the mids, the highs. You don't want to lose a lot of that clarity and that punchiness by just bringing everything just too crushed when it comes to compression. And so, you can use a multi-band compressor to, bring into each of the different instruments so you can really dial in the sound. But, before you get to that level, maybe something a little bit more simple, like Sound Goodizer or Sausage Fattener. There's all sorts of compressors out there that you can kind of toy around with. When it comes to a compressor, I like to have the ability to mess with the attack time and the release time, especially because if you're doing something that's really just hitting hard, you want the attack time to be pretty low, so it doesn't have that kind of hump to it and kind of dull the sound. But each one of those types of things is something you learn as you're doing, how you're trying to shape each sound. Really can get really in depth with like a multi-band compressor where you're breaking it into the low, the mids, the highs, and then you can tweak the attack time on each one of those. I like to use that especially on guitars, a multi-band compressor versus like a Sound Goodizer, which is just like a generic, this is just like a blank kind of compressor that just has a one knob and that's it. With a multi-band compressor like Maximus, for example, you can really dial in how that sound is sitting in a mix, how to shape it. Again, especially if you're using visuals, then you can use a multi-band compressor to really dial in the sound that you want. And samples you can do the same thing with. But yeah, those are just some quick techniques to take your mix to a next level. I know when I first started, it was like always a challenge to like, how do you get that professional sound out of mixes? It doesn't make any sense, but it's a lot of little moves combined over the entire track that make it really stand out. And so with that being said, I appreciate you guys liking, sharing, subscribing, all the social networking things. I appreciate your support, and until the next video, God bless.